Suffering and Death Part 2, the Trials, the Burial and the Resurrection. The Sanhedrin Trial, or the trial before the Jewish council. They brought Jesus to the chief priest's house. The council tried to find evidence against Jesus, and their stories did not agree. They told lies. They said Jesus said he'd tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Have you no answer? Jesus kept quiet. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the blessed God? Jesus said, I am, and you will see me at the right hand of the Almighty coming in glory. The chief priest tore his robes and said, Blasphemy. They all agreed he was guilty, and they brought him to Pilate. In Jesus' time, a trial in front of the Sanhedrin should have been fair. But was Jesus' trial fair? So was Jesus' trial fair? Well, Jewish trials shouldn't be held at night. It was. The final verdict shouldn't have been given until the next morning, but the verdict was given straight away. They should start with finding the accused innocent, but in Jesus' case, he was thought to be guilty straight away. The evidence was only valid if it was agreed by 2 witnesses. But in Jesus' trial it was confused and conflicting. The high priest shouldn't have asked a direct question, but he did. It was only blasphemy where God's personal name was used. Jesus didn't actually use God's name. Blasphemy is to say or do something insulting against God, or to claim for yourself what only belongs to God. So why were the rules broken in this trial? Well, some scholars think that the Jews were made to be responsible for Jesus' death. And the reason for this is that the Gospel was written in the 1st century with Roman persecution, and they didn't want to anger the authorities. They wanted to encourage the Romans to think that the Christian religion was a good one. But then again, the Sanhedrin would have normally kept to the rules. Maybe it was just because they were so desperate to get rid of Jesus. He was such a troublemaker. You can stop the clip to read this slide. So why did the Sanhedrin hate Jesus? Well, Jesus was seen as leading the Jewish people astray. He broke the oral tradition developed by the scribes that was written to help people keep the Torah and the law. He also mixed with outcasts and challenged their authority. Do you think that the Sanhedrin were justified in breaking the rules? The chief priest held a meeting with the elders and the whole council. They then bound Jesus and took him to Pilate, who was the Roman governor. Pilate asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, So you say. They brought lots of accusations against Jesus, and again Pilate said, Have you no answer? Jesus was quiet. He didn't say anything, and Pilate was amazed. There was a habit at Passover time to release a prisoner. Pilate said, Who do you want me to release, Barabbas or the King of the Jews? Do you want me to set free for you the King of the Jews? And the crowd shouted, Crucify him! Jesus was put to death because he was called the King of the Jews. The Romans wouldn't have understood the Son of God as an accusation, so the Sanhedrin had said that he was calling himself the King of the Jews. Maybe the Romans weren't really responsible for Jesus' death, because Christianity was spreading, and the Gospels wanted to play down Pilate's part and blame the Jewish authorities. Jesus was the silent victim. He was the suffering servant. This was prophesied in Isaiah in the Old Testament hundreds of years before. Josephus was a historian back in that time, and he said that Pilate was incredibly cruel, and in fact he was removed from office for being so cruel. So would he really have allowed Barabbas to have been released? Or maybe he could have released both Jesus and Barabbas. So there's lots of questions here and evidence that you could put forward. The mocking of Jesus, he was dressed in purple. They put a crown of thorns on his head. They said, Hail, King of the Jews. They hit him, they spat on him, and then they led him out to be crucified. So who do you think was responsible for Jesus' death? Was it the Jewish priests, the high priest, Pilate, Judas, Jesus, or the crowd? You would need to think about this and come up with an answer. A classic GCSE question is, Pilate was totally to blame for Jesus' death, for and against. Yes, you would say only Pilate could pass the death sentence at that time. He knew Jesus wasn't guilty. He was a weak and cowardly leader, and he tried to shift responsibility to the crowd. He put political survival before justice. Other views would be no, the Sanhedrin, they lied to Pilate saying that Jesus was saying he was king of the Jews. They knew Pilate couldn't afford to have a riot or trouble on his hands at Passover time. You could say it was the crowd's fault because they allowed themselves to be manipulated by the Jewish authorities. You could also say it was the crowd's fault because they supported Barabbas. You could also say that it was Jesus' fault. Why didn't he defend himself? And finally, you could say it was Judas's fault because he was the one who ultimately betrayed Jesus. The Crucifixion and Burial. Many of the details found of this part of the Gospel are found in Psalm 22 that was written 1,000 years before Jesus' death. For example, you can find, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me? You can also find in Psalm 22, all that they see me, laugh me to scorn. Also, he trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. And finally, they part my garments among them and cast lots for my vesture. So a lot of what you find here is prophesied. The crucifixion. Mark and other early Christians believed that Jesus' death was foretold in the Old Testament. Jesus was beaten and flogged. Simon of Cyrene helped carry Jesus' cross to Golgotha. Jesus refused a drugged drink. 2 others were being crucified with him. The inscription on the cross said, King of the Jews. Passers-by taunted Jesus. He said he'd destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Come down and save yourself. Jesus was alone and desolate. There was darkness over Israel for 3 hours, which was symbolic of a terrible sin that had been committed. Jesus used Aramaic words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Those around thought he was calling Elijah, who was thought to return when good people asked him to come in times of trouble. The tearing of the temple curtain was symbolic. Jesus now, his death had torn down the barrier, separating humanity from God. The Roman soldiers saying, surely this man is the Son of God, is very important. For Mark, it meant that Jesus really was the Son of God, and even a Gentile recognized it. Mary, and Salome were watching from a distance, showing the important role of women. So why is the cross such a powerful symbol? The cross represents victory over sin. Through the death of Jesus, our sins of the world are taken away. Jesus' death was a sacrifice. He was paying for the wrongs of all humans. Also, we become one with God. Atonement means at one meant. Jesus' death on the cross gives us a new chance. It gives us hope for eternal life. The cross is the most powerful sign of love in the world. God so loved us that he gave his only Son. Jesus' death on the cross opens new life for us with God in heaven. It allows us to know that Jesus is suffering when we suffer. Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was dead already. He agreed, and Joseph took Jesus' body, wrapped it in a linen sheet, and placed it in the tomb, putting a stone across the tomb. It was significant that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, were watching from a distance. Mark particularly mentions the burial to stop false beliefs at that time about Jesus. It did take courage for Joseph of Arimathea to ask for the body. And finally, it was Sabbath, so there was no time to anoint the body. And as I said before, the two Marys were there watching from a distance. The resurrection of Jesus. The empty tomb. Mary and Salome went with spices to anoint Jesus' body. They were saying, "Who's going to roll the stone away?" But when they got there, the stone had already been rolled away. They went inside and they were alarmed. They saw a man dressed in white, an angel. "You're looking for Jesus. He's been crucified. He's not here. He is risen. Now go and tell the disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead to Galilee." They were distressed and terrified. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So the man was an angel, and the women were the first to hear of the resurrection, which was quite remarkable at the time. This is the first ending of the Gospel, and it's a very abrupt ending. It almost ends on a note of despair. Why would the Gospel be finished so abruptly? Well, Mark could have died before finishing the Gospel, or the parchment on which it was written could have been damaged. More likely, Mark intended it to finish here so that the reader is left to reflect on the importance of the resurrection. The longer ending of the Gospel was probably added on in the 2nd century. The first person that Jesus appeared to was Mary Magdalene. She went to tell the disciples, but they didn't believe her. Jesus then appeared to 2 disciples in the countryside. They went back to the disciples, but again, the disciples didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. Jesus then appeared to the 11 disciples. He was cross with them. He rebuked them for their lack of faith. He then gave them the commission. He said, "Go and preach the good news. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever doesn't believe will be condemned." The believers will be given power to perform miracles, to drive out demons, to speak in tongues. They'll be able to pick up snakes and drink poison without being harmed. They'll be able to lay their hands on sick people who will get well. Remember, this is the commission at the end of the Gospel. Previously, we had the mission earlier on where they went out in 2s, but this is called the commission. It's important for you to know this. Finally, Jesus ascends to heaven. He became a spiritual presence in the disciples' lives. The ascension shows that Jesus is King and is now with God. So what does the resurrection mean for Christians today? Try and remember this acronym, VPLTED. Victory over evil. Jesus' resurrection shows victory over evil. It shows God's power. It also shows us that Jesus is here now living and is present with us. The teachings of the Gospels are trusted because predictions came true. Evil is now conquered and death is not the end. We can go to heaven with God. So what do you believe happened to Jesus' body? Well, Christians believe he rose from the dead. But alternative views could be that the Romans took the body away and buried it, or the disciples stole it to make it look like Jesus had risen. Maybe Jesus wasn't really dead at all, he was just in a coma and he woke up. And finally, the women couldn't see clearly possibly and went to the wrong tomb. These are all possibilities that you could use in your GCSE answers. Stop the slide now and read this. Did the resurrection really happen? Yes, Mark was inspired, God has power, the centurion knew, etc. No, Mark could have made mistakes. There's contradiction of the law of nature. The women went to the wrong tomb. Maybe Jesus was unconscious, etc. Appearances could have been wishful thinking. So stop the slide and have a look at this in more detail. In the next 3 slides, you will see all the stories about the death and the burial and resurrection of Jesus. Can you go through it and be able to use the keywords and the pictures to actually talk through the stories? By knowing these 8 stories, you should now be able to answer all GCSE questions.